Hi everyone, and welcome to this first question. This is my response video to the perspective question in Module 1. A couple of housekeeping things to do, which I will do on these videos from time to time. So let me do those first, and then let me get into your questions. First one is there was a problem with with Beagle this week, which resulted in some of the browsers not being able to access Beagle. I was using Chrome and I could not access Beagle to see how your questions were going. And so I know I got a lot of emails from you that Beagle was down. It was down to some of the browsers. And so I've extended the deadline. I still got actually a lot of questions in. What I want to say is if this is the first time this has happened with Beagle, I've used it for a couple of years now. I've never had this problem, this particular problem, at least. And so I will I will say to you, if it does happen again, if you ever can't access it and you were getting that message about the cookies that I was getting and you were getting from your emails, I know that. Try a different browser. I did. I switched to Microsoft Edge and it was fine. Beagle, I've talked to them. They told me that that's finished now. They fixed the problem that they had with Chrome and with the other browsers, and so you should be able to use it. I understand that Safari actually has never worked very well with Beagle, and so so. Other than that caveat, I'd say use whichever browser you think you would like to use. But if it doesn't work, obviously try another browser. So the deadline's been extended to Saturday and Sunday with that. But I am going to go ahead and answer these questions that you've written. Those of you that were able to get them in, I'm going to answer a couple of those, and then just know that going forward, if you haven't been able to submit it yet, you have until the end of Sunday, and yeah, and try a different browser if it doesn't work in future. I want to move on now to something else. I've noticed in these questions that I'm about to respond to, there are some questions that are not based on the theoretical reading. I want to turn your attention right now over to the syllabus. Look at the perspective questions section in the syllabus. It clearly states that the perspective questions should be based on the theoretical reading. I've marked the theoretical reading in the modules so that you can tell the difference. I think you would probably be able to tell the difference anyway because they are quite different, but I have marked them right, in case there's any doubt. So these questions should be focused on the theoretical readings, and in fact you will lose points because it's in the syllabus. It's fairly clear, it's in bold, it's been there since the beginning, and because I'm making now this video, certainly in the future your points drop. You'll score 0 in the future for any questions that are not very clearly based on the theoretical reading. Okay, that goes for upvoting as well. Please don't upvote any questions that make it on there that are not about theoretical reading, because actually the most popular one the most popular one this week was a non-theoretical reading question. Okay, so this is not just 1 or 2 people here, right? This is a lot of you, and so I will well, certainly in future, I'm trying to work out whether I will do this now or not. I think I'll let you off on this first week, but now that it was in the syllabus anyway, and now I'm talking to you about it for a second time. So after this, you'll just score a 0 if you do one of those questions. It's based on the generalist article. What I want to do with this course, the whole idea of the course is that, look, things are happening in the world. Hey, have a look. Here's the journalistic readings. And political science has done some work in this area and wants to try to understand these sorts of cases better. And here's how they're doing it. Right? And here's some of the theoretical work that's been produced that attempts to help us to understand these real life issues that we're seeing and that we're faced with every day. This is what political science does, and this is how it tries to understand the world. These are some attempts. So, and try to see the sort of generalized and general theories that help us to understand more than one case. Right? So I don't want this course just to be about this particular case in our first module, like coronavirus. I don't want this to be just about coronavirus, because this particular coronavirus at least will go away at some point, I hope, in the next year or 2, right? But the thing that won't go away is securitization, right, and health security. That will remain an issue, and remain a concept within political science that will attempt to explain how to deal with it and what we do as people and as governments to try and and rectify these sorts of situations. So that's where I want the focus to be in terms of content. So that's it. What I want to do before I get into answering the questions is just do a quick description of securitization, which I think is important for our reading, and also mention a couple of different ideas about power, and then I'll get into answering a couple of your questions. Okay. Securitization, you encountered that word I think a few times in the reading, but the reading was very much about securitization. Securitization is simply put is about making a particular issue a security issue. When you make an issue a security issue, and we'll talk about the process, that enables you, whoever you are, to use extraordinary measures to deal with it. So we're seeing this exactly now. We're seeing very extraordinary measures right now in the United States, in San Francisco, for example. And I think in San Francisco, people are confined to their homes. That's an extraordinary measure. We don't do that, I don't know, as far as I can remember in my lifetime, I don't think I've ever been confined to my home. Not by the government, maybe by my parents. It's an extraordinary measure, right, for the government, either the government of your city or the government of your state or your nation or even an international organization, to restrict you to your home. In Italy, they have policemen and soldiers on the streets asking you why you're out of your house. That's extremely, that's extraordinary. That's extraordinary for Italy. Imagine if they were doing it here, and we're not that far away from there right now. So that's what we mean. Securitization, it causes an issue like the coronavirus to become a security issue and then warrant extraordinary measures. So giving you the example of extraordinary measures. Very quickly then, this is the process. Securitization is a theory within international relations that it's fairly recent, fairly new from probably the 90s, but it's very popular even now. A lot of talk about it, as you see in this article. But the process is this. So you have some issues are not political issues. Some issues are political issues, and if they're political issues, we use normal processes, usual measures. We might use the police or whatever other resources we have. I can't think of any of the state resources that we have. It doesn't just have to be with the government either. It could be in a university, right? There's some situations that we would use normal measures. We have a policy manual that we would just apply, right, in usual situations. And that would be roughly equivalent to a political issue. The next step on the line is, so you've got politicized, and then we've got securitized issues. Securitized issues, those ones are the ones where we use extraordinary measures, where we look in the rule book and there's nothing even in the rule book, and we sort of put the rule book aside and say, or perhaps there's something in the rule book that stops us from doing the thing that we're about to do. But we say this is an existential threat. This issue, coronavirus perhaps in our case, is an existential threat too, right? And it's not just any sort of a threat. It's not just, we're kind of worried about the coronavirus. This is going to end something. This is going to end our life as we know it, right? That might be one thing. This is going to completely undermine and destroy our national security. This is going to destroy the readiness of our military to underpin and sustain national security. This is going to destroy our life as we know it. This is going to kill all of our old people, right? So it's an existential threat, a threat to the existence of something, right? And that's what justifies extraordinary measures. We say, if we don't do this now, this extraordinary thing now, we won't exist anymore, or that thing won't exist anymore. This institution won't exist anymore, right? The government won't exist anymore. Our security won't exist anymore. We have to do it now, and never mind what it says in the rule book. In the Constitution. So again, I'm making it about the government, but it doesn't have to be. But very oftentimes it is in international relations. Okay, so we've got the existential threat, the thing that's going to, and then the thing that's going to be destroyed or undermined and ended forever is the referent object. That's what we call that. And then and then we need an actor. We need an individual like a president or somebody like that, or an institution like the CDC or somebody to stand up and say and identify this as a security issue. This is an existential threat to this referent object. we have to use extraordinary measures now. These are the extraordinary measures that we have to use. They have to say that to an audience. So that's the last element of the securitization process, is the audience. So they say to an audience, the audience says, we believe you accept that. The audience might be the general population in a country. It might be military commanders. It might be anybody, right? Or any group of people, depending on the situation, right? So this is sort of a general theory that describes how things go from not being a security issue to being a security issue. You've got the securitizing actor who says it's a security issue. You've got the issue itself, which is characterized as an existential threat. That's an existential threat to a referent object, a particular thing that will go away and not exist anymore if we don't take the extraordinary measures. That's it. I think the audience, did I mention audience? Okay, the audience have to accept the explanation. So that's securitization, and it's important. You can see now how it's not that the thing itself, it's not that the existential threat has some sort of qualities within itself that makes it a security issue. It's a social process, right? It has to go through that process to become a securitized issue. And think of nuclear weapons on this. Nuclear weapons, of course, are very destructive and do have qualities within themselves that make them destructive and deadly and threatening. But that alone isn't enough to make them a securitized issue. In fact, if we go back right to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we'll see that they're much more of a securitized issue than they are now. We're not really, these days, not at the same level. It's not as much of a political issue. It's not as much of a securitized issue. Every now and again, it flares up a little bit with Iran, with North Korea. But not to the same level as during the Cold War. And it's not as pervasive. And you'll see ebbs and flows. Like, hey, today it's a political issue, tomorrow it's not a political issue. Today it's a security issue, tomorrow it's not. Maybe not today and tomorrow, but over time. And that's not because the real substance of nuclear weapons has changed. It hasn't changed, right? Russia still has a ton of nuclear weapons. We still have a ton of nuclear weapons. The Chinese still have nuclear weapons. Israel still has nuclear weapons. Pakistan and India still have nuclear weapons, right? I don't know why I'm just naming all the countries that have nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons that they have are just as destructive as they were before, right? But we're not taking extraordinary measures against them in ways that we were before, right? Which might be, right, teaching school children to hide under the desk, or building nuclear shelters for everybody, or what would be some of the extraordinary measures? We're not making everybody test themselves, for radioactivity, or we're not. That might not be a thing that they would do anyway. I might give up on that one, actually. We're not training ourselves for nuclear war. We're not training our population for nuclear war anymore. Or building large amounts of infrastructure to deal with the nuclear fallout, whereas we might have been doing those things in the past. Okay, so but that's to sort of support the argument that it's not about the thing itself, right? The thing itself hasn't really changed, but it's about the social process. It's about this process of securitization. That's the theory. Okay. The other thing I should talk about a little bit is power. And particularly, he mentions Foucault in here, and he talks about a Foucauldian system of power. We're oftentimes used to thinking about like the government exercising power, especially in the United States. We're a little bit jealous of power. We worry about the government abusing power. Right? It was a theme in American political thought since the foundations of the United States. We don't want a government that gets too strong and abuses its power. Foucault, who Nunes is building off here, or who he's co-opting in some ways, at least his definition of power. Foucault doesn't see power like that. Foucault doesn't see power exercised by some actors over other actors. He's not looking at some subjects that are powerful and other objects that are not powerful, and the subjects that are powerful exercising power over the objects. That's not a Foucauldian conception of power. What a Foucauldian conception of power is this. It's more of a network. If you think about nodes in a network, those points in the network, and we're all sort of connected in some sort of a relationship to one another, institutions, individuals, groups of people, schools, universities, hospitals, the president's office, the White House, Capitol Hill, the CDC, the UN, the supermarkets, right? Anything, right? Everything in society is connected in this network. And power exercises itself sort of through those nodes and through those connections. Right? So power then, I suppose, is almost its own agent, and it co-opts us, and it makes us, it sort of forces our hands sometimes to do things, but it's not that the government's forcing us to do so. And in fact, the government itself is being forced to do things. And the government itself is constituted, right? It's made up. There's something constructive about Foucault's idea of power, that power sort of works through us and constructs us, right? It makes us who we are, sort of by acting through these relationships that we have with other nodes in the network. So it makes us who we are, and it allows us to act as the people that we are on the other people around us, or institutions around us. So it's sort of a force, it's sort of a force, an agency unto itself, but it's not exactly, it sort of needs our agency to function as well. So anyway, that's the conception of power that Nunes is I think, fixed on here. And so with those two things sort of in the bag, if you want to go back to the reading with the light of those, that might be helpful for like a future essay that you might write in a midterm, or if you haven't written your prospective question yet, those are some good areas to go into. All right. So I'm going to go now on to these questions, and the first one I'm going to answer, again, some of these are not based on the theory, so I'll usually choose the most popular, but since this time the most popular was not based on the theoretical reading, I'm not going to take that one. But the second most popular one was, and it says this: domination can be defined as the systematic production of the privilege of some groups at the expense of others, by the exercise of arbitrary influence or as a result of existing rules in society. So this idea of domination began to make me think about our own government processes. In our government today, is domination an issue? To this point, is domination bound to happen since subjectives shaping self-understandings are commonplace in our government? And I want to say this, I want to say again, Nunes is probably not thinking of the government as exercising power or as sort of dominating the rest of the system. However, although there is a little bit of that, and I think even in this quote, I see a bit of a slippage here, right? Some groups at the expense of others, or the exercise of arbitrary influence. I see that the exercise of arbitrary influence does suggest that model of power where we have some people exercising power over others, which I think is not very Foucauldian. Right? I think that might be, it's either a slip of Nunes or it's his attempt to sort of marry, which he is doing, to marry the Foucauldian idea of power with Luke's idea of power. And so maybe we get both these concepts of power sort of mashing up against each other. But I also read into your question a little bit that maybe you don't mean, maybe that's not what you're saying. Right? Maybe when you say government processes, you're not talking necessarily about the government, the processes that the government uses. You're maybe talking about something that Foucault might talk about, right? Sort of the practices, the processes that govern us. We have a system of government. Now, the system of government, in this sense, I'm not talking about, oh, we have a democracy or a republic or something like that. But what I'm talking about is that there's, the societal rules, right, which is existing rules in society that cause us to act in certain ways and ask us to behave in certain ways. And we can resist it to some extent, but even the resistance is somehow a relationship to these rules, right? And these rules are the government processes, maybe is how you're using that term. And in that sense, you're really tapping into this Foucauldian idea of power. Is domination bound to happen since subjectivities or subjectives are commonplace in our government? And I'd say Nunes thinks yes. I think Foucault thinks yes. That there's no real escape from these relationships of power. There's no escape from governmentality. Governmentality is what Foucault, the way Foucault describes this sort of system of power, right? This There's power through the nodes and through that constitute our being. It's not really escape from that. And so, yeah, this is what happens. And I think Nunes uses that sort of as a basis of his own questions. And remember, here's what he's doing. Let me describe a little bit what he's doing. Because he wants to argue against the international relations literature, and there's a lot of it there about securitization. And he wants to say to them, look, don't be so don't be so negative about securitization. Yeah, sure, it leads us to being quarantined in our homes. And it leads to extraordinary measures being taken by securitizing actors. Yeah, sure, it does that. But it actually improves people's lives. Right? The weaker people in society who don't have health security aren't able to direct their lives as they wish, but securitizing health and making it a security issue is advantageous to them. Right? That's his argument, and it's an argument against the prevailing literature in international relations in securitizing issues. Right, so that's important to recognize. He has an uphill struggle to argue that, but that's what this paper is trying to do. So. You know, part of the difficulty he has, I think, is this Foucauldian concept of power. Yes, absolutely, Foucault recognizes that different nodes in the network of power, if you like, have different roles, right, and have different roles. But he doesn't emphasize too much sort of the agency of one to exercise power over the other. Ultimately, and this probably goes back to Hegel, right, in the master-slave dichotomy that I probably don't want to go into because this video is already quite long, but in a very small nutshell, right, the idea is that, you know, both the master and the slave are ultimately captive by the system that they're in. Right, the master, he appears to be exercising power over the slave, but ultimately we come to realize that the master is dependent on the slave for his identity as a master. Right, so any power that he exercises as a master is dependent on the slave following those instructions. Right, and that's a Hegel thing. But I think through Foucault we get a similar. You know, I think Foucault maybe takes something from Hegel here, right? Where, you know, power is, I don't want to say it enslaves everybody, but it creates subjectivities in the system and sort of limits their actions, I suppose. Yeah, that's a fair thing to say, and sort of defines their actions to some degree. And so then the difficulty of making the argument that, well, some people are, yes, Foucault accepts that some people are maybe at a disadvantage, but maybe that's more of an apparent thing than a real thing. Right? Everybody's subject in the same way, even if we have different roles to play. There you go. And so I think it's difficult for Nunes to make the argument that he's trying to make. That's my argument. All right. And then the second question I want to answer then is this one. It's, I think, the fourth most upvoted. Power, so this argument goes, does not simply emanate from the government or the sovereign ruler. Instead, power is something that circulates between nodes in society. Hospitals, schools, churches, or civil society organizations. That's what we've been saying. Individuals are not helpless targets, but rather conduits that always have the capacity to resist power to some extent. When in times of nationwide panic like we are currently in, when the government severely limits individuals and nodes' power, their ability to go to work, school, or leave the house at all in some cases, at what point is the responsibility of the government to provide more for the people when their power to provide for themselves is limited? I love this question, and it gets right to the heart here of what we're saying about Foucault and power and what Nunes is trying to argue. And I think it gets to the reason why Nunes' argument is kind of a difficult one to make. And I would answer simply with this, right? I'd say, look, I think the question is still sort of, it's trapped in that other definition of power, right? That we have some agents here who are powerful, we have some agents over here who are weak. And Nunes himself is trapped in that too, and he keeps sort of reverting back to it in some ways. Some individuals are powerful, some are weak, and the powerful exercise some control over the weak, or that somehow the powerful could help the weak, right? Which is a big part of what Nunes wants to say. But I think he's making it difficult for himself with Foucault. Anyway, so I'd say this then, that uh, to say that the government severely limits individuals and nodes' power, that is a conception of power that's not Foucauldian, which is totally fine. Obviously, I'm not, but which jives a little bit with it sort of it interferes with the argument that Nunes is trying to make. It makes it much more difficult, even though he sort of needs it to make the argument as well. So that's why I think it's a difficult argument. I've said that a couple of times. What I really want to say here is that the government severely limits individuals' power. The way that we maybe, a different way to look at the question is this, a different way to look at the situation is this, is that the government itself is influenced by power, by something else, by the rules and the expectations that exist in a society. They have to do this. They themselves are no more free to either to limit our power or to take responsibility to provide more for us. Their agency is limited. It's limited by power. And think of it this way: ASU have closed down the campus classes, right? So the on-campus classes, we're not having them. We're having them online now. So, and the fact that could they have chosen a different way? Could they have said, no, we're going to carry on meeting regardless? Right? Could they have done that? Their choice was restricted. Maybe even if we say, yeah, they could have done that. But the choices are restricted by expectations that we as faculty have, you as students have, expectations that the government might have, that local municipalities, expectations that people with elderly people or people with reduced capacity to deal with the coronavirus might have of them. Right? And so they're as much limited in what they can do by power as we might be, right? But could the government have said, let's not worry about this, right? Let's just could the CDC have done that? Could the CDC have said, we're not going to self-isolate, we're not going to ask you to self-isolate, we're going to let this pandemic run its course and kill X number of people, right? As the CDC, their role as the CDC sort of requires them, their position in the nodes, in the network of society as a node, it requires them to behave in a certain way and to do certain things. And our own position in society requires us to do other things. And so, yeah, this is sort of an agency limiting theory here that we have. Or it's a model of somewhat more limited agency. Not just for you and me, but for actors that appear to be powerful, right? Like the government. And so that's the answer there, I think. I hope that this video will help you to go back to the reading and to get a lot more out of it. I realized actually when I started reading this through again, I thought, wow, this is quite an ambitious reading if you haven't already had a background in securitization and in these different theories of power. We haven't talked a ton about health in this video, which I'm a little bit disappointed with, but we talked a bit about the coronavirus. Certainly, right, his argument here is linked to health, right? It's linked to health security, health as a securitized issue. Right? What sort of advantages does that bring? Right? It brings these advantages of extraordinary measures which can be used to help people who don't have health security, right? Weaker people in society, people who don't have access to proper public health. It can help them if health is securitized. And of course, securitization theory and Foucault, it doesn't always sit very well with each other, because you've got, with securitization, you have this securitizing actor, right? This agent who's deciding to securitize a particular issue. And you have an audience who also have agency to decide whether or not to believe that and to accept the securitization move. And so governmentality, I don't think goes very well with that. It's so difficult to marry those two concepts. But that's definitely what Nunes is trying to do here. And I think that's why he gets into some difficulty. But nevertheless, a very interesting reading, timely. It says something about about treating health as a security issue, which we are no doubt doing with the coronavirus. We've got those soldiers going out. Anytime you get the army involved, it's a security issue, right? The army is supposed to sort of defend our borders, right? That's the main idea behind the military, right? Is to defend ourselves from other militaries. When we start using them inside the country, it's a little bit extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And I realize, of course, that we have the Army Corps of Engineers and all those people who, and all sorts of bodies, military bodies that act within the country. But whenever we're using soldiers sort of on the streets, that's an unusual situation, an extraordinary measure, I would argue. So that's it. I hope that helps. If there's any questions, do feel free to email me, and I'll get back to you. But this hopefully gives you a strong basis for an essay on this topic in a midterm.